Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next webinar in our Quickfire webinar series. I'm Chris Harvey. So today's session is on effective planning for product recall success. And if you've not attended one of these Quickfire sessions before, they're just that. They move very quickly, more conversation style, more interview style. So we'll talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll save some time at the very end for questions. Next month, we're actually going to pause our Quickfire webinar series for our quarterly recall index webinar. If you've not seen one of those, it does examine the data, the trends that occurs from quarter to quarter or year to year across different industries. So be on the lookout for that. So August 20th will be our webinar for the US marketplace, and August 28th will be for the European version. So again, I'm Chris Harvey. I'm Senior Vice President of Client Services for Sedgwick. I've been working on recalls for over 20 years now, so I've seen a lot of them go well, some go not so well, and planning and preparation are really key. I'm really honored to be joined by Joe Rizzo, my colleague today, who has spent the last 6 or so years within the industry concentrating on compliance and product safety. And I know he's got some great insights to share with us today. So welcome, Joe. If you want to say a little bit about yourself, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it. Definitely my honor as well to be here. Just to give you a little bit of background, guys. So my name is Joe Rizzo. I'm with Sedgwick. I'm our Director of Product Recall Solutions. I recently joined Sedgwick from Samsung's product safety team. And previously to that, I worked in the consumer product space and medical device industry as well. I have a background in product safety, risk sensing, and also product recall management. And I'm hoping to bring to you today a little bit from both perspectives, from a Sedgwick perspective of where we help clients manage recalls, from actually a manufacturer's perspective from in-house managing recalls in real time. And because it's a very different perspective, you know, when you're actually in the middle of the hurricane or when you're a service provider helping a manufacturer. So I'm hoping some of the insights that I bring today will help make your next event much more easy and smooth going forward. Hope you don't have one, but if you do, this might help.
Yes, thanks, Joe. Great to have you. So product recalls rarely follow a predictable path, whether they're triggered by consumer complaints, regulatory scrutiny, maybe supply chain disruptions. Your ability to respond with speed and compliance really hinges on the strength of your preparation. And that's really long before an issue does arise. So planning is absolutely critical for recall. So again, I'm excited to have you and talk through some of the details here, Joe. I do want to remind the audience that your lines are muted, so you can enter questions directly into the chat module. We'll monitor that throughout, but we'll probably save some time at the very end as well. We will also share a recording of this if you want to further share with your colleagues or look back on it. So with that, Joe, let's go ahead and dive into your first insight that you have.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to give you a quick overview here. So we're going to go through 5 different areas. We're going to talk about the customer journey. We're going to talk about incident and injury reporting. We're going to talk about response management to escalations from regulatory agency or consumers. Then we want to talk about remedy effectiveness. And then last, communications and messaging. So those are the 5 areas we want to focus on. So taking the first one is the customer journey. So we know during a recall that we're doing our best, because it's a crisis, to put together an effective, strategy and response plan. But sometimes what's overlooked is the customer journey. And the customer can mean your selling partner and, of course, the end user, the consumer. So one of the things that I've done and I found very helpful is actually building a workflow and a decision tree for each touch point during a recall. And I think that's really important to visualize that, to be able to see it, because there are going to be situations that arise during a recall. I mean, the best plans laid out, something can and will go wrong generally. And I think some of the complexities of the recall can contribute to that. So depending on if you have a very complex remedy, depending on there may be different options for consumers and customers that can create some operational challenges. For example, there could be call center shortages. You didn't anticipate how many calls were going to come into this. So if we had mapped out this, journey, we can understand a potential, pain point, and we can have a contingency in place in that event. Another thing we see sometimes is a website goes down. Sometimes it gets flooded and a website will crash. Well, what's your backup plan for that? So having that journey really helps to understand, because one day down with the website, it can be a nightmare for a manufacturer, just considering what that looks like, guys, right? Big recall, website goes down, it's not pleasant. And then also there could be some, restraints on replacement parts, depending on the remedy. So having this all mapped out helps to identify bottlenecks, inefficiencies, and improve recall effectiveness overall. I think personally, some of the areas within mapping out the journey, it helps you visualize the customer experience, which is really important, because until you actually are in the recall and launching it, things that occur that you didn't anticipate for. So sometimes putting it on paper really helps. Also, another area is test the suitability for your selling partners. Because yeah, of course, your end consumers are important, but you want to make sure that your solution is also viable and feasible for your selling partners, right? And also foster cross-functional collaboration and accountability. By building out this customer journey, you have to involve other departments in there, and you have to assign accountability. You can be the task force leader, but you really have to make sure that every department is on board. They understand their role and responsibility. And in the event something does go sideways, how are they going to remedy it? Also, what's great is building out this journey is it helps you establish performance metrics and KPIs. So we want to understand, hey, what's the average hold time for a consumer calling into our call center? How long does it take, to be on the call? What's the average call length, right? So you have to monitor that performance to make sure you're staffing correctly, to make sure that, maybe there's something you didn't consider, maybe it's a very complex recall, and you need to think about maybe we need to add more call center agents to support this recall. And that leads to resource allocation too. So when you're building out this journey, you can help identify, long-term, recall management needs. Because to be honest, guys, at the beginning of the recall, your first 2-3 months are going to be the most intense, no doubt about it. But a recall is going to go on for years. So you have to have a plan in place to manage how you're going to handle the remedy, responses. This could go on for 10 years. So you have to have a long-term plan in place when you're thinking of building out your journey. And then I also think there's also some side benefits to doing this, where it helps you understand the customer, right? And it helps you understand like segmentation based on customer behavior. So you really understand a little bit more about your customer and how they're engaging with you. So that can also lead to some real, good feedback for developing your customer journey and experience going forward. So I think there's a big opportunity there with customer journey, Chris.
Yeah, all great points, Joe. I love this one because many times recalling firms, they're just thinking about the compliance box that they have to check or the liability they have to reduce that risk. But realistically, this is also their brand that spent
right.
years building up, and they don't want to have missteps in a recall. So understanding what the journey is, understanding how consumers are going to want to interact, it's really important. And I don't always see recalling firms doing this process. So this is great advice. It's not a one size fit all for recalls. You can't just replicate what you did on the last one. You really got to identify the specifics on this one.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. And I think you're right. Every recall is different. And we always say that a recall, yes, it's a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. It's a great opportunity to learn more about your customer and also build up your brand and your reputation. So Chris, moving on to the second item here that we have on our list is, incident and injury reporting. So during a recall, depending on the, the injury that you're seeing or the safety hazard involved, and the likelihood of a potential product misuse, you're going to have to develop a protocol and a process for identifying those incidents that are perhaps quality related, maybe safety related, or maybe misuse, right? And also the different types of injuries that can occur depending on the type of recall. So one of the things that I was really important and thought was very important doing is developing that framework, right? That injury reporting framework, and doing a risk assessment and creating a methodology to really identify that difference. And I'm really talking about quality versus safety versus misuse, and understanding the differences. And really important is trying to eliminate bias, because sometimes we're a little bit biased because we know the product, it's our product. How could someone possibly use it in this manner, right?
Yeah.
But you have to understand some human factors, right, and behaviors, and really understand, how the consumer is using the product. So when you're receiving in those types of incidents and injuries, developing that methodology and logic to really understand how you're assessing each one of these, because you need to report that back to stakeholders, regulatory agency, to really have consistency and confidence in what you're reporting back. And also, if you're seeing perhaps a different type of misuse, that's an opportunity that has to be addressed. And maybe it's something that you need to look at from perhaps your product manual needs to be changed, or maybe there is a design, issue that needs to be addressed, that engineering needs to come in and get involved. So understanding like those incidents and injuries, and understand, Chris, from a compliance and reporting standpoint, you have to report them, but you have to know which ones you're reporting and why, and be consistent with that. And I hope that resonates with the audience here today.
Yeah, good point. Do you think most companies struggle with this today?
They do, Chris, because it depends on the complexity of the recall and the type of hazard involved. Because sometimes you can have different types of injuries that can occur from the same hazard, and then trying to understand from a manufacturer's perspective, well, how did that injury actually occur? Like help me understand it, because there's a real practicality of, hey, I want to know how this happened so I can prevent it in the future going forward. So I hate to say it's always case by case, but unfortunately it's always case by case, because every recall is a little different from the last one.
Yeah, to me, this is a good roundtable discussion, getting some companies together to benchmark and talk about how do they do it, what's best practices, what's not working, just to have an open discussion on it and see where companies can do better.
I think so, Chris. Yeah, no, this is a real big open-ended one for sure. The third item I wanted to talk about, guys, is response management. So one of the things that you're going to see during a recall, right, there's going to be a lot of different escalations and communications through different channels, right, coming in through social media, executive, regulatory agency is going to have complaints coming in, Better Business Bureau, customer service, and the list goes on. So one of the things you need to do as a team is to have a cross-functional team with a task force leader in place to define and set clear rules, roles and responsibilities, how responses are crafted and written, because you cannot have different responses going to different channels. That's just going to be a recipe for disaster later on. It's going to come back and haunt you in many different ways if you're responding to different channels with different responses. So this has to be a well-coordinated response, type of team. And also, I can't stress enough that your responses, you should anticipate what most of the types of escalations are going to be ahead of time. You should have a pretty good sense of that with your FAQs. You should kind of have an understanding. So a lot of this should be pre-scripted, should be written ahead of time, and you should go through your legal, your PR team, your customer care team, your safety team, your quality team, have everybody review these responses just to make sure they're aligned, they make sense, right? And that they're also accountable. Because one of the things we want to do is, and I've seen this too many times, well, someone will just be a little bit too zealous and respond quickly, in the effort to try to be very quick, but provide a bad response, which leads to a lot of problems later on. And that can go not only to your consumer, but also to your selling partner. So you want to make sure your, responses are very well aligned, both internally and externally as well.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think with this, it's important, I think, for executive teams and leadership to understand the importance of this and the importance of compliance. There's no shortcuts in safety. And really, I think there's just this need for the executive team from top down to be able to support this. It just helps from a preparation standpoint to reduce the impact that can come on from a recall standpoint. So really important to these cross-functional teams.
It is, Chris. The one thing we underestimate, and depending on the size of your organization, you may have a very good social media team, and that's great, but that response has to have been scripted and planned ahead of time, because there's just, for larger companies, there's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of departments, and unless there's a unified task force leader that everyone is, following, and someone who can vet all the responses, you could have some missteps there, which can lead to some escalations, which you don't want, additional risk already.
Right. Good points.
For sure. So guys, moving on to our fourth item here, I wanted to talk a bit about your remedy effectiveness, and specifically about leveraging the technical evidence, right? So when a company has a recall, depending on your remedy, right, it's really important to make sure you're clearly communicating that, effectiveness of the remedy, right? And I think that's all pretty understandable. Everybody understands that. But what you should really be looking for is your response rate to your remedy. If it's low, or you're seeing a lot of negative response to that, it might be because of the lack of trust in the remedy itself, right? And the clarity of it. And one of the things I'd like to promote is always, demonstrate your solution and why it works, why it's a long-term, a good fix for the safety hazard, and show that with data. Don't be afraid to put some data up there and said, what, we've tested this in this environment, we've tested it here, because you're trying to build confidence with your consumer and your customer, right? Because it all ties back to your brand and your reputation. Because I've seen, and Chris and I have seen, some good ones and some not so good ones, and you start questioning, saying, okay, that is going to actually lead to more escalations. That's going to lead to more questions, because that is not a very clear remedy and it has not been communicated well. All the best intentions, but how you communicate it and support it with the data instills confidence that is going to just be a multiplying factor later on. And you'll start getting those positive reviews and comments about how well you manage the recall. That's also really encouraging as a company, and especially from a PR perspective, starting to see consumers saying, wow, I really appreciate this company stepping up, doing the right thing, understanding what the risk is and communicating it, and telling us why that this remedy is effective. Because you don't want to lose the customer by doing a refund necessarily. You want, if you have an effective remedy, show it, right? Show the data, it's tested results, prove it and show it. And then Chris, I don't know if you've come across this in your experience over 20 years of doing this.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing is just be transparent. Transparent, clear, and concise. And I always say, when you write a recall letter, especially to a consumer level recall, it should be at a 10-year-old reading comprehension level. Make sure they understand the details of the remedy and why it's approved, why they should feel safe after it's been implemented, why they should take action on the recall as well. So transparency can be very important, just as much as speed of moving quickly as well. The other piece I'll mention, we're seeing a lot of litigation and class actions related to the remedy. So the better job you can do up front with your remedy, and sometimes you do spend a little bit more money at times on the remedy up front to reduce the risk and some of the costs down the road as well. But yeah, very important to be able to look at that proactively and be transparent.
Yeah, Chris, and I would always encourage, if you can engage, independent verification of your remedy and testing, from a third-party lab, some kind of endorsement or certificate. That really goes a long way with consumers to see that you've done that homework. So I think that's really important as well. No, good points, Chris. And everyone, so last but not least is, of course, really important also is communications and messaging. So during a recall, you have two sets of customers you got to think about: your internal customers and your external customers, right? Those are two different audiences, right? And your messaging has to be really precise to each one of these audiences, right? And the strategy as well. So, and I think though, one of the things that I've seen sometimes is not enough empathy in the messaging, right? You have to understand, right? Your company made a mistake, right? And you're trying to rectify it. And yes, you're providing all the logistics and the actions that need to be taken, but the tone in that letter or whatever, wherever you're posting that message is so important. And if you don't have, a team that can, develop or script that, that's really important that you seek that out, to have some really talented people who are good writers, who understand, how to set that tone. And you also want to come across with a unified voice, across all different departments and platforms, because you're not only selling this product this day at a brick and mortar, right? You're selling this through e-com and many different channels. So you really having a unified message is very important. Coordinating the timing. Sometimes we've seen missteps done here where there will be a communication made in the wrong order, if you will. So perhaps not, communicating to the regulatory agency, which I can't imagine that happens too much, but it happens, unfortunately, sometimes. So the timing is really important in coordinating that release. And really also, I think is important is the formats too. How are you going to communicate too? What different formats are you going to do this on, right? There's so many different, ways to do it. You're going to do videos, infographics. Are you going to maybe use a chart, a table? There's many different ways that you can communicate your message and get it out there depending on that audience, right? And again, I can't stress about this is an opportunity to communicate empathy and understanding, and that you're doing everything to rectify the situation. And so some of the different areas, guys, that you want to always focus on, obviously, is internal and external communications, media and public relations, and digital and web, your digital and web presence, right? So those are 4 areas that you want to make sure that you're targeting. And we can really, if we had more time, we can go into real detail into each one of those, because there's a different communication for each one of those channels, and also different types of communications as well, Chris.
That's probably a separate webinar in itself of just going through the different communications. Really important to customize the communication by the audience and how they like to communicate as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, Chris. Yeah, no, because you're looking at all different types of, newsroom posts. You're looking at media reactive statements, website banners. I mean, there's so many areas that we can touch about and how those should be structured and the tone. And I think that's really important, how you get the communications correct.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Having templates of these is going to be highly beneficial, so you don't have to start from scratch. That you can get your email template, your letter template, your press release template, and be able to utilize those while your hair's on fire.
Yeah, Chris, I think, personally speaking, when I was experiencing some recalls at my past, employer, that we spent a lot of times, dozens of iterations on communications over and over, rereading every single word and making sure it hits the right message, the right tone, and depending on that different audience member. So we spent a lot of time, a lot of nights, making sure that messaging was correct. So.
Yeah, very, very important. Well, Joe, thank you so much for sharing a lot of these insights. I do want to make sure that we answer some audience questions. So again, in the chat module, you can just type those in, and Joe and I will address those. There is one here, Joe. Maybe Joe and Chris, do you have a KPI for each step of the process to know it is progressing right? How do you define a successful recall deployment? Any comments on that first, Joe, and then I'll go?
Yeah, for sure, guys. So one of the things when I talk about KPIs is so my background when I was at Samsung was coming from the customer care department. So product safety was in customer care, and customer care and product safety worked hand in hand. And when we developed KPIs, we were looking at, for example, call center. We want to know, okay, what is your typical call, before you had a recall? Understand what that performance KPI is, right? And then that's how you're setting your KPI going forward, right? Because in a call center operation, you've already got KPIs established and performance metrics. So what you're trying to understand is, are you still meeting those same KPIs and performance metrics prior to the recall than as you're doing during the recall? Because if you're seeing a fluctuation there, if your hold time is longer, for example, as I mentioned earlier, or if your talk time is much longer, something is not right there. Either the message is not correct, the remedy is not correct, the instructions to the agents are not correct. So that should give you an indication that something is not right compared to pre-recall versus during recall.
Yeah, I think too, a lot of people get hung up on what's the response rate currently. And you can't just look at it the same from recall to recall. Every recall, again, is slightly different, and there's different parameters or areas, factors that can contribute to a higher or lower response rate. So what's the hazard? How recent was the product distributed? How often is the product being used? Is the media getting a hold of it? How expensive is the item as well? So you can't always compare the fact that after a first month of my last recall, I already had a 25% response, and then after 6 months, I've got an 80% response, because it is different from recall to recall. But some of those details, Joe, that you mentioned from the call center stats, how quick you're processing product, how quick are you getting reimbursements or replacement product out, and the key here is to stay within the expectations that you set. So are you saying it's going to be 3 to 4 weeks to get a replacement part, 2 to 3 weeks to get a check, and you stay within that? I mean, those are important KPIs, I think, from a brand loyalty standpoint. The second part of that question too is, how do you define a successful recall deployment? Well, first and foremost, you don't want injuries or incidences to continue to happen weeks, months after the recall has been announced. Unfortunately, it's very tough nowadays to get consumers to pay attention and to chime in and to respond. At minimum, you want them to stop using a defective product as well. So, but what you don't want is those injuries or incidences to continue, because that's a sign of an ineffective recall.
Yeah, Chris, that's a real big one. And that almost ties right back to our incident and injury reporting methodology and logic, right? Trying to understand, if you're identifying this risk properly, because if you're seeing incidents and injuries either just staying at the same level and you're not really seeing a decrease, then there's either something going on with the remedy, the communication's not right. And so that's something that you really want to pay attention to. Absolutely, guys. That's a really good metric. Good
Absolutely.
points.
And Joe, just coming from industry, what's the number one lesson that companies learn the wrong way? What's the number one that you feel like that you see the number one misstep that they just, if they would have been better prepared, they probably would have avoided?
Yeah. What's funny, Chris, having been in industry, I think you don't really think you're going to have a recall. You don't really talk about it. And inside industry, you don't necessarily have a recall department. That doesn't exist. And so it becomes a task force. And you're pulling in people from all different places together to try to manage a recall. And not everybody has recall experience. So one of the things I think I would love to see more companies do is to actually do more recall readiness, do recall testing, right? Do a mock recall, right? Just understand, what if you did have a recall? How would you react? Like, who would be the task force leader? Who would run the project, right? Is it out of your project management office? Like, how would it actually go down? Take a week and just, talk about that. So I think recall readiness, Chris, is something that's lacking inside industry, because no one wants to talk about a recall until you have a recall. And sometimes that's too late.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Good point. So I think we're about out of time. Just on the next slide, these are just QR codes if you are interested in joining our recall indexes. So again, on August 20th is the U.S. edition, and recalls are spiking, I'll tell you, especially with consumer products and some of the other industries. European had some record numbers last year. I think we're continuing to see a lot of that. We'll also do an Australian version as well. So that'll be in August to come. I don't see any additional questions. I know in the chat module, we did put some links that you can register for those as well. So stay tuned for more information on the webinars. Joe, thank you so much for joining and sharing your information. Again, to the audience, thank you for joining us today. We will have a recording of this available, but thanks again, and everyone have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Chris. Take care, everyone. See you soon.